Friends, good evening. It's been several months since I did my book talks, and I'm now resuming them and want to begin with this book called The Memory Monster by Yishai Sarid, who's a writer from Israel. The book has been translated into English by Yardenne Greenspan. And Yishai Sarid lives in Tel Aviv, where of course, now we have a war going on, but that's a subject of another talk. Let me begin by saying that it was a friend that drew my attention to this book, and this was a few months ago when I was on the verge of undertaking a visit to Poland in connection with a very ambitious and large project that I have commenced upon, which will take several years. But that too is a subject for another talk at some point. And, I'd mentioned to this friend that I would be visiting a number of sites that were concentration camps. The phrase concentration camp is not very instructive. In fact, some scholars, particularly of the Holocaust, have argued that we should be far more precise in how we describe some of the camps, because some of them were labor camps. There were a few camps that were set up explicitly as death camps or extermination camps. And then there were, in fact, other camps that were both labor camps and extermination camps. Auschwitz, the most notorious and the most well-known of these camps, was indeed a monstrously large labor camp, in addition to, of course, being the site of the extermination of Jews, Poles, homosexuals, political dissidents, and others. But at this juncture, I don't wish to discuss the differences between the camps. And indeed, there are many other camps as well, such as transit camps, because when one is speaking about camps, one is speaking about concentration camp universe, really, right? A camp universe, because there were over 1,000 camps. This particular book is, in fact, a novel. And it is really quite a remarkable novel. So this friend of mine said, you must read this before you go visit these camps. I visited 6 camps in Poland in the course of 20 days. And the book, The Memory Monster, we first get this phrase in the book itself because this phrase doesn't appear otherwise. And I will turn to the phrase in just a moment. But I want to first describe very briefly how this book is shaped. So the book has a narrator. The narrator is a person who wanted to earn a degree in history and initially wanted to study, he says, the Far East, but he had no knack for studying either Chinese or Japanese. And instead, he becomes a specialist writing a doctoral dissertation on German death camps, and it turns out that this particular narrator is going to do that is become an expert on these camps by becoming a tour guide. He's a person who leads visitors from one camp to another. And so in the course of his life as a guide to these camps, the narrator tells us something, but not as a historical narrative as such, right? Recall that this is a novel. It has a fictional character. This fictional character is the narrator. And this narrator then ends up telling us quite a bit about places such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. And I think that this is one of the things that we have to introspect about when we think of this novel, because of course the novelist, some critics would argue, does not have the same kind of ethical responsibility perhaps that, let's say, a scholar has, particularly a scholar writing on this concentration camp universe, on the Holocaust, would be held accountable for various kinds of statements. I mean, there's such a massive scholarship on the Holocaust. And so let's say if a scholar made certain kinds of claims, well, those claims would then be subject to analysis by historians, by sociologists, by people who are Holocaust specialists. As a novelist, perhaps he's not subject to such scrutiny. But of course, the question here is whether the narrator, in fact, and the narrator's voice are simply a way of disguising certain kinds of views that are very much dear to the author of this book itself. So there is another side story, which is where we get this phrase, the memory monster. Let me dispense with that, as it were, before discussing some of the aspects of this novel very briefly. This side story is that the narrator has a son, a young boy. His name is Ido, and Ido is being bullied at kindergarten. And you can now begin to see some of the resemblances between the story of his son and the story of the Jews. In that, just as the Jews were being bullied, his own son is being bullied, right? And so the narrator says that one day, his wife calls him, the wife and their son, they're living in Israel. And remember that this narrator, this fictional narrator, he is often out of the country. He is on tour because he is conducting these guided tours where he is taking visitors, typically students, but we are going to find out he has other constituencies that he caters to as well, typically taking them from one camp to another. And so, his wife calls him and says, well, you really got to come back and you've got to spend some time with our son because he's constantly being bullied. He doesn't want to go to school. So one day when the father comes back to Israel, then he spends a few days there. He goes to the kindergarten of his son, and he yells very loudly at the other students who have been bullying his son and threatens them. And this restrains them. But the consequence of that, we are told, is by Ido, when he's speaking to his father, the consequence of that is that all the children henceforth stopped playing with him, right? They stopped playing with him. So before he was being bullied, but they would still play with him. Now none of them wants to play with him at all, right? And so what is the origin of this particular story, right? The origin of this story is, so this is around page 71. The publisher of this book, incidentally, is a very small publisher. The book came out of Brooklyn, New York, by a publisher I had never heard of. I think I've heard of literally hundreds of, if not maybe, 1,000 or more publishers, but certainly hadn't heard of this publisher, Restless Books, and the book is translated from the Hebrew. And so, what is the particular origin of this phrase? And so, he's saying that he had been talking to his son, and so his son asked him, and here's a conversation, page 72. What's your job, Dad? He asked. He tells them about what happened. Ruth offered, so that's Ido's mother. What happened? Ido widened his eyes with worry. There was a monster that killed people, I said. This is the narrator, the father, saying that. And you fight the monster? He asked, excited. It's already dead. I tried to explain. It's a memory monster. Now, memory. How does a memory of what happened continue to haunt us what kind of nightmares does it still induce, not only within Jews and within survivors, but what kind of memory does it induce, right? Within everyone who's to some extent a thinking person, with everyone who's thinking about how did it ever come to pass that people could just be killed by the hundreds of thousands, 20,000 sometimes killed on a single day, right? And one of the things that has been said is that the Jews sometimes were like lambs taken to slaughter. And one of the interesting things about this novel is how it sort of, rather than regurgitating these kinds of comments, really puts them into question. It's a beautiful novel. I mean, very chilling in some ways, but a very beautiful novel. And how does it do? And the narrator says, this analogy of them being taken like lambs to the slaughter, he says, is uninstructive, and it's incorrect. It wasn't lambs being sent to the slaughter. Lambs are fed fresh grass. They are fattened up before they are killed. The Jews weren't fattened up before they were killed. They were starved. They were bullied. Sometimes they were tortured. Right? This is apart from the question of whether the Jews offered resistance, right? And that's not really the subject of this particular book. But going back to a point I'd made earlier on, I was saying that, what is that we know what the responsibility, at least in principle, of the historian and of the scholar is. That when they make certain kinds of claims, there's certain kinds of accountability. And here what you have is you have a book which, in fact, actually really does give you a great deal of historical truth into many of the things that transpired in these camps, but the narrator doesn't really have that kind of responsibility, and therefore he can play around with certain ideas with a greater ease than could perhaps the scholar. What might be an illustration of that? The illustration of that is, and remember that the author himself is an Israeli, and you certainly can't accuse this author of being anti-Semitic, particularly if one knows the tenor of his other work as well, right? So, the narrator is describing a conversation that he's having with a teacher, and this is when they have gone to a camp which I also visited, which the Germans call Kulmhof, and which the Poles know as Helmno. This is a camp which comes, sort of halfway between Poznan and the city of Łódź. The city of Łódź itself is about an hour west of Warsaw, and Kulmhof or Helmno is further west of Łódź. And so he's escorting a number of students with their teacher to this camp and taking them around, and he says, the narrator says, when he's having this discussion, I spread my arms and said human beings were capable of anything, especially murder. They relied on ideology or religion. Even us Jews back in biblical times murdered women and children, I reminded them, by explicit orders from God. I don't know why I decided to get into that. It was clearly a mistake. How dare you make that comparison? The teacher railed, taking one step forward, prepared to defend our national honor. Right? So this is a group of Israelis who are visiting this. I told her that I wasn't making any comparison. It's just that children have always been killed, even now. Not like that, she said. Not like the way in which children were killed in these camps by the thousands, mercilessly. That's true, I said, but your question is feigning innocence. Don't you know people are murderers? It's in our nature. End quote. And you see, that's what I mean when I say that, no book on the Holocaust, a scholarly book or a book written by, a sociologist, historian, even perhaps, let's say, a philosopher might be, would dare today that certainly would dare to say as much and would certainly be much more circumspect. But here, the narrator is saying that, he's a tour guide and he's going to these camps from one camp to another, and he's talking to people about what really happened there, but then he ventures forth with certain comments about human nature and suggesting that, well, the Jews are really fundamentally no different. Maybe that's the spirit in which the teacher might have understood or could have understood that remark, that the monopoly for evil does not reside with one race of people. It may be that was what the narrator is really trying to say, but as I said, what's interesting here is that merely because this is a novel or a fictional account, one shouldn't think that the author hadn't deeply researched the subject and wasn't deeply informed about it. What really struck me was some of the kinds of information that he conveys, which, frankly, you'd have to read a lot of the Holocaust literature to be able to get that information. So, for example, although I've read a great many books, I really haven't seen many references, or indeed any reference before this, to what his unquestionably one of the most powerful set of poems ever written by a Jewish person about the experience of the Holocaust. I'm referring here to a book by Uri Greenberg, Streets of the River, the Book of Dirges and Power, published in 1951, right? He also has a very brief discussion where he talks about the fact that every concentration camp, every death camp, actually had an orchestra, or nearly every camp had its orchestra. So there was a Treblinka orchestra, and as these Jews were being marched to their death, some of the other Jews were commanded to play some music, right? And so what he's this may strike some readers of the novel as merely as an eccentric little detail, but what he's trying to suggest is that there's something that is somewhat unfathomable. This is extraordinarily eccentric, you might say, that as Jews are being marched to their death, being sent to the gas chambers, being asked to strip themselves naked and then go into this gas chamber where they were going to take, quote, a shower, right? That an orchestra is conducting them to this along this march to this site with music, right, to the accompaniment of music. He has a brief discussion of Belzec, the fact that there was virtually only one survivor out of the hundreds of thousands that were killed at Belzec. A great many more survivors from Auschwitz. if for those of you who've read some of the Holocaust literature, you may have thought to yourself, why is it that so many of the diaries of the survivors are from people who were interned in Auschwitz? How come Auschwitz, where more people were killed, also had many more survivors than any other concentration camp? And that, again, is another story, but part of the reason for that, of course, a principal reason for that, has to do with the fact that Auschwitz was also a labor camp. Belzec was not a labor camp. Treblinka was not really a labor camp. These were death camps. They were set up explicitly for the purpose of exterminating the Jews. And when Jews who arrived within days, they were killed. Right? The novel is beautifully written. It's really beautifully written. It gives us some insight into this camp universe. The narrator is deeply informed, but he is also quite ironical, and he discusses the various constituencies of visitors whom he escorts, students, and then he says that when he became well known for this kind of work, when it was recognized that he was a concentration camp expert, then he also was hired to in fact become a guide for members from the Israeli military force, from the Israel Defense Forces, and the security forces, and that groups of people from these security forces would come. to these camps, and then he would then sort of guide them. He reminds us that we only know the stories, of course, of the survivors, naturally. 75 to 80% of the people who were sent to the camps were killed on the spot. I mean, literally within hours, within a couple of days. We don't know their stories as such. We only know them in a way secondhand from the survivors. Their stories, as he suggests, is really never told. And he poses many difficult questions. He tells us something about, for example, the people who got defined as the righteous among the nations, right? These are people who helped save the Jews, and their names are now recorded with gratitude at Yad Vashem, the National Memorial and Museum to the Holocaust in Israel. But one of the things he points out, and he's not the first person to do that, but he does it in a different way, because he's really talking about some of the ironies of this. He's talking about the fact that the saviors are themselves going to be hunted down in various ways very often. He says that some of the Poles, for example, who saved the Jews, that they were afraid of revealing their identity. They were afraid of revealing their identity because they, in turn, at the end of the war, were going to be hounded. Sometimes they would be persecuted themselves. And one of the reasons for that, as the narrator tells you, is that the Germans did to the Jews what the Poles wanted to do, what the Polish wanted to do, what Polish Catholics wanted to do, but couldn't do. And he has, as I said, some of these ironical remarks. Sometimes he puts them in the voice of someone else, where why is it that the Poles did not do the killing that they let the Germans do, because the Poles were too soft, for example, right? And he says that that's one reason why. And this is, of course, I think clearly one of the more controversial, perhaps, aspects of the book. I don't know to what extent it was reviewed, but clearly the suggestion here is that, and in fact he says that the narrator says that his experience in guiding these students and others was that many of these people, they didn't hate the Germans as much as they hated the Poles, right? And remember that the death camps were largely in Poland. And when I say death camps here now I'm not using in the strict sense of the camps that were set up explicitly for the purpose of killing, because, of course, Dachau was a death camp too, but Dachau didn't start off as a death camp. It started off as a camp for political dissidents, for communists, for people who were considered to be undesirable. Eventually, of course, people were killed there as well. But he puts... he says that, the narrator says that he overheard conversations among some of the students who, he says, incidentally, they were always busy with their iPhones. So he describes, and were never attentive, and he describes some of the difficulties in trying to make people understand what happened at these camps, and finds indifference. But he says that sometimes he overheard these students saying, oh, the Germans did it, but they were handsome men, they were blonde, muscular and all of that. Yeah, the Poles, they're soft and they're dirty, etc. Right? So it's a fascinating novel, beautifully written. It can make you feel uneasy, but of course, much of the Holocaust literature can do that. But this is a novel. It's not a historical or scholarly account as such, and it's a book that makes us reflect on not just the Holocaust and not just on the concentration camp or the camp universe. It makes us reflect on things like memory. It makes us reflect on how, for example, a place like Auschwitz has now in some ways been commercialized. That was my own experience of visiting Auschwitz 6 to 8 weeks ago. And I'll end on this note. Thank you.